Hello, everyone. Welcome to RSRT's presentation for this afternoon, the results of the Rett Orca study, how Rett families are impacting clinical trials. We're just going to wait a sec for everybody to kind of pop in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Jana von Hehn. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of the Rett Syndrome Research Trust, and we are honored to have our guest speaker today, Dr. Bryce Reeve, who is the director of the Center for Health Measurement at Duke University School of Medicine. He is also a professor of population health sciences and a professor of pediatrics there. He is a well-renowned expert in the field of outcome measure development, and we were lucky enough to work with him on this really important project. So welcome today, Dr. Bryce. We're looking forward to your presentation. And before I turn it over to you, I just want to give a little bit of background for our audience here. And just to start, I just wanted to say quickly, we found out about the Orca through Allison Berendt, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And when we read through the questionnaire that you had developed for them, it was so incredibly relevant for Rett syndrome patients, and it was the best communication scale that we had ever come across, and we were thrilled to find that amazing tool, and then reaching out to you and having you agree to adapt this cool tool for Rett syndrome was amazing, and working with your team has been amazing. So I just want to start off with that. I'm going to quickly dive into just a little bit of background, not to take up too much time, but I just want to orient our audience here. So the Rett Orca is a communication scale that we're developing, and it's really part of a larger overall strategy. And we have a number of different initiatives that we are pursuing to support biopharmaceutical companies that have development programs in Rett syndrome. And so in addition to our other efforts that you may be aware of, our Rett Syndrome Global Registry, and our non-clinical initiatives that help out in the lab, the Rett Orca is really part of our outcome measures development program. And this is where we're trying to generate Rett-specific measurement tools for key symptoms developed at FDA standards. And so the Rett Orca is a specific communication scale that measures communication ability specifically for Rett syndrome. And we're really excited to be presenting this study to you, the results to you. And before we dive in, I just want to give a little bit of background on what an outcome measure is, just to kind of set the stage. So measurement tools are, outcome measures are measurement tools that rate a symptom. And this is how you can determine if an intervention, if a therapeutic, a therapy, or some other intervention is impacting a patient's symptoms. And typically you assess patient function or symptoms through questionnaires where you would answer a bunch of questions on a scale, either a parent or a clinician, a scale where you would just rate like from 1 to 10, how do you feel, or 1 to 7. You can also record information in a diary. You can also do functional tests like walking tests or breathing tests, or even physiologic measures like ECG outputs or EEG outputs, for example. So those are all types of outcome measures. And this is really how clinical trials assess efficacy. So you need to have a scale or some measure of symptoms prior to starting an intervention, and then you redo that assessment later after treatment to see if there's been a change. And we're really excited about the Rett Orca because it is the first Rett-specific scale to assess communication ability in this population, and that makes it really well suited to our group of kiddos, and we're really excited about it. So I'm going to stop talking and turn this over to Dr. Reeve. So let me just stop sharing. And you can take it over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. And for you and everyone else, just call me Bryce. I appreciate it. It's a very huge honor and pleasure for me to be able to chat with you all today about our work with the Orca measure and partnership with the Rett Syndrome Research Trust to be able to deliver for you all an important measure that you all can use in your research setting. And none of this could be done obviously without the funding, but most importantly, through you all out there in the audience, through your help in our studies there, to make sure what we're developing is an appropriate measure of your child's communication ability. So you'll see another thank you again later on, but I want to start with a thank you overall. So as Jana said, I'll be talking about our Orca measure, and as a measure of communication ability for individuals with Rett syndrome, and the process of what is the Orca, our development process, and how we expect it to be used in research studies. So our overview today, what I plan to talk about over this time, I plan to spend about around 35 minutes talking and leaving about 15 minutes towards the end of my talk there for you all to ask any questions. I think there's a way that you can send questions to the chat or whatever mechanism there is. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And if I don't get a chance to answer your question, I'm happy to answer any questions by email. But during my 35 minutes, I plan to talk about the importance of good quality measures in clinical research settings. It'll be a little bit similar to what Jana presented. I'll ask a sort of rhetorical question. Are there available good measures of communication available for use in research in Rett syndrome? My third part, we'll be talking about the Orca measure itself, and then importantly, our evaluation of the Orca measure to make sure it's appropriate to assess communication in individuals with Rett syndrome.
And Bryce, just before you get started, if you don't mind just going to full screen, that would be great. And I just want to reiterate that if there are questions, to go ahead and put them into the chat. Thank you.
Make sure I am sharing. Is that full screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. So first, I need to start with disclosures. Importantly, as you see on here, is the study team, including myself, have developed the Orca. That's the technology term you see on the slide there. So we developed the Orca measure. If the Orca measure continues to be successful as it already is, for commercial reasons, by commercial means that if industry and pharmaceutical companies use our measure there is a license fee to use it, and those fees come back to both the Duke University, for which I work for, as well as the developers, to help us continue to do research on the Orca measure. So I need to make that particular disclosure. I also need to disclose that any view I provide is just my own personal view. If I get it right, it's on behalf of my team in the university. If I get it wrong, it's just my own personal view. That's my disclosures. I also want to make some upfront acknowledgments, and again, you'll see us towards the end there, to those that have funded our work. That includes, as Jana mentioned, the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, who funded our original work on the Orca, the Rett Syndrome Research Trust, who funded our work to validate this measure in individuals with Rett syndrome, as well as you'll hear later on, we've received some additional funding from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to expand our measure to other rare diseases. To be honest with you, the brains behind this operation are everyone except for me. And I want to highlight some of their contributions, not all of their wonderful contributions, or else I'll be here all day talking about them, which they do deserve the recognition. Importantly, I want to highlight Nicole Lucas, who is the overall project coordinator for all aspects of the Orca measure. And without Nicole, none of this could have ever happened in the timeline and as successfully without her help. So thank you, Nicole, for that work there. Our research team has a whole bunch of different expertise to help contribute to the development and of the Orca and the success of the Orca. Folks like Nicole Lucas, Molly McFactors, and Leslie Zapato, Livia, they are all qualitative experts. We have quantitative experts, statisticians like Christy Ziegler, Lee Lin, and Dan Chen. And then we have speech language pathologists, communication experts, and Kelly Gordon and Harrison Jones are part of our core team that helped develop the Orca and validate it. And without them, none of this would be a success. So the first part of my talk, the first thing, as I said, I want to talk about is how important it is to have good quality measures in clinical research settings. And as you heard from Jana, the whole reason we do clinical research to begin with is either to help us understand about a disease, disorder, or condition and how it impacts families, or we do clinical research to help identify ways to help improve and identify interventions that help improve individuals' lives for the individual as well as the family unit. There's lots of different clinical research type of studies that can be done for a variety of different reasons. You might hear about natural history studies where we routinely collect data over time to help us again understand a condition and how it progresses over time. But the real gold standard of clinical research, the type of study which helps us provide definitive information about whether an intervention is safe and effective, are randomized clinical trials. And they are designed in a way that has comparators to evaluate whether it's like a gene therapy or some other type of treatment is both safe and effective. Now, whether we're doing observational research studies or clinical trials, it's really important that we are measuring what actually matters and makes an impact both for the individual as well as the families that help support that particular individual. And when we think about Rett syndrome and thinking about what kind of things we want that matters, there are many different types of areas, and these aren't all of them that we want to focus on to evaluate whether this intervention or multiple interventions are safe and effective. So the kind of things, categories we can think about is the disorder or disease status, and we might look under that category looking at brain function or bone health. If we're looking at areas of functioning, we might think about looking at measuring things like cognition, motor skills, and communication. We may be interested in measuring treatment benefit in terms or side effects in terms of symptoms such as seizures, sleep disturbance, GI distress, depression, or anxiety. Or we might think of more globally is how quality of life impacts from the intervention in terms of relationships with family and friends, as well as family impact. 15, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of our clinical trials were maybe focused on one particular area like disease burden and use those as primary outcomes without looking at more global things like quality of life. But over the past 10, 20 years, there has been a huge shift in our research studies to make these things what's called either patient-centered outcomes research or patient-focused drug development. And the reason why you see the patient's name first there is we're trying to improve the ways that we conduct trials to actually answer questions that, again, matters to the people that are impacted the most. And for Rett syndrome, this is not just the individual that we're trying as the primary focus to improve that individual's lives. We also recognize that the family unit is also impacted. And so again, it's important in the more modern research field there is that we ask ourselves what matters most and make sure we include diverse stakeholders in that process to make sure we're measuring not just one outcome like brain function, but measure a whole array of outcomes that, again, are important for the individuals as well as family units. And as we think about these different sort of categories of outcomes that we can look at to look at treatment benefit and treatment safety, we have lots of different ways we can measure these different types of outcomes and what I call is the toolbox of measurement tools. And there's lots of different tools we can use out there. So for example, if we're looking at a health condition or disease status, we might use biomarkers. And by biomarkers, these might be things like a blood sample, a tissue sample, saliva sample. It might include x-rays as well. Those are the kind of biomarkers that we typically look at, like brain function and other aspects of that. Other tools we have might be digital monitors. And so an example might be, many of you have your phone or an activity tracker that can track such things as your movements, getting up and down, or walking ability or stress in terms of functional movements. Digital monitors are typically passively collected data, but they are important and are tools we actually use in research studies. Other things that we do, other tools we have are performance tests, and typically those are used to assess a patient's functioning. And so performance tests could be like for mobility. We could ask the person to walk a few steps from one side of the room to the other. We might be ask a child to pick up a block or put a block on top of another block. Those are the type of performance tests that we use to assess functioning. What I'm going to focus for the remaining part of my talk are on surveys and questionnaires. These are actually sort of questions that are sort of assembled together. And these questions can, again, give us information about how a person functions, like their communication ability, their symptoms, such as sleep disturbance or pain or anxiety, or quality of life impacts. And surveys and questionnaires can be filled out by different stakeholders. In some of the work I do, we have patients themselves fill out these questionnaires for Rett syndrome, and for the Orca measure, we're asking the caregivers to fill out questionnaires. We could also have questionnaires for clinicians as well. The important part of thinking about these measurement tools is, importantly for clinical research, there is a certain standard that we need to make sure that these measurement tools are appropriate and sensitive enough to be able to assess change in whatever outcome we want to look at over time. So if we're looking at communication, we know that we need a good quality measure to be able to make sure that if that child's communication ability changes from pre-intervention to after they receive their treatment, to see if there's changes overall. And if it's not developed in the right way, that intervention might be effective, but if the measurement tool is not appropriate, then we could miss out on the opportunity to find those interventions to help out patients with Rett syndrome. And then secondly, we need to make sure that there's lots of different measurement tools out there, but they could have been developed for some other population. And so importantly, we need to make sure for Rett syndrome that these tools have been evaluated to make sure that they are clear and relevant and capture those unique aspects of communication or whatever we're measuring for Rett syndrome themselves. The third point I want to make there is to recognize that all these measurement tools have some kind of error associated. There's no perfect measure. So we need, again, make sure that we develop in a way that makes sure that we capture the signal of communication or whatever we're measuring there above and beyond the error or noise that is always a part of any measurement tool, whether it's a blood sample, a X-ray, a questionnaire, or performance-based test. And then it's important to recognize as well there is that for any particular outcome, just like communication, there are different ways and tools we can approach it from different stakeholders. So for communication, we could have the caregiver perspective, we could have a clinician perspective, or we could have performance-based tests. And it's important to recognize that each different perspective is valuable and can contribute to help us understand what's going on in that child's lives. The second, and again, this is my rhetorical question because I sort of know the answer here, is that the question is, if we're focused on looking at communication in individuals with Rett syndrome, why not choose one of the existing tools off the shelf that we know already exists out there? And so as part of our process, and what we do typically when we're looking at developing a tool like communication ability is we do go out and look at the literature and see, okay, is there already an existing tool out there that we can actually use? Because there's no sense in wasting money and time developing a new tool when something already exists. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel when already there's a good measure out there. But after our extensive review of the literature and talking to a lot of experts, we recognize that there is not an existing good quality measure of communication ability for individuals with Rett syndrome. And that's because, number one, we identify whilst there are some measures out there, typically those existing measures require a speech language pathologist or some other clinician to help complete those particular measures. Now, while those measures can be good, The problem is, and you all probably know better than I do, is that we know that when children are asked to come to a lab or clinic there, they typically don't behave in a way like they do in their home settings. In addition, we recognize that for a communication expert, like a speech language pathologist or a clinician, to observe a child, they're only observing that child in a very narrow time or framework, maybe for 5 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour there. They are not in the perspective like a parent of seeing that child over a month or years or anything like that to help judge that child's communication ability. Number two, we recognize that many of these measures are really good for identifying where a child may need help and tailoring for clinical care or for tailoring their training and education to improve their communication, but many of the tools out there aren't developed to actually be used in a clinical trial. Number three, often these tools have not followed the best practices and guidelines for developing questionnaires, and you'll see some of the steps later on in my presentation. Number four, typically many measures do not include patient or parent advocates in the oversight and direction of the design of the measure. Many times they might have included parents as sort of participants in the study, but rarely do they actually include parents as part of the advisors or directly involved on a research team to develop the measure. And that's something we actually hold strongly, is we feel that having parents help us along the way to develop it helps strengthen the quality of the measure, of the Orca measure at the end. Number five, we realize that when looking at existing communication measures, they often rely on the evaluation based on the child's verbal speech ability. However, recognize many in Rett, it's the same thing was with Angelman syndrome, many other types of neurodevelopmental disorders, that many times their kids don't use verbal speech. They use gestures, they might use devices, they might use their eyes, they might use vocalizations, but oftentimes don't have speech. And because of that, point number six is many children with Rett syndrome with these other existing measures, because they're not often using verbal speech, they often score at what we call the basement. So they're all sort of at the bottom end of the scale, and they're not being differentiated. And if every single kid is getting the exact same score at the bottom or basement of that scale, then we are limiting our ability to determine if a new gene therapy is actually making an impact on their lives there. So we need a scale that doesn't rely on verbal speech, but uses other modalities to assess where that child is in terms of her or his communication skills and how they're changing over time. And then lastly, we recognize that for all these existing measures, there was no good quality evidence that they work well for individuals with Rett syndrome. So there was not sufficient evidence for the quality of the measure, for which we're trying to overcome. And so for all these reasons is why we ended up designing the Orca measure for Angelman syndrome, and why, as you heard from Jana, the Rett Syndrome Research Trust is very interested in adapting Orca for individuals with Rett syndrome. So let me give you an overview of the Orca measure. Some of the key features of the Orca measure. Number one, as I indicated earlier, is the Orca measure 100% only relies on the caregiver and parent perspectives. So caregivers can fill out the Orca independently, and it does not require anyone else to help them fill out the questionnaire. This means that the parent can fill out the Orca measure either in a clinic or in the comfort of their home. And again, no one else is interpreting what the parent's saying there. So I think that's a unique feature that is ideal for getting complete and good quality data in research studies. The second aspect of the Orca measure is it captures a whole range of different types of communication ability, including expressive forms of communication, receptive forms of communication, as well as pragmatic or social forms of communication. And I'll give you examples of all three of those forms on a subsequent slide. The third aspect of the Orca measure is that, as I know, that it does not just simply rely on verbal speech, is that the Orca captures different types of communication behaviors, or what we call modalities, including eye gestures, head nods, body movements, and use of devices to communicate, which I think is an important aspect for the Rett syndrome population. The fourth bullet is we developed the Orca specifically to be used in clinical trials where you can use the Orca as a baseline assessment of where the child's communication ability is. And then after the child receives a therapy, you can use the Orca again and then look at changes from before to after the intervention to look at changes to help us evaluate whether this intervention or gene therapy is actually improving their lives. And then the last point I want to make there is we developed the Orca for Angelman syndrome. However, we developed it in a way that we feel that the way the questions are asked and response options, as well as the type of communication captured, could be relevant to Rett syndrome as well as many other neurodevelopmental disorders. As I noted, these are the types of communication concepts that we capture with the Orca measure. And we've categorized these into expressive communication, receptive communication, pragmatic or social communication, as well as the child's vocabulary. Under expressive communication, I won't read all these things in the interest of time there, but the type of expressive communication we assess with Orca are when a child tries to seek attention, direct attention, refuse an object, request an object, request more, asking questions, and other aspects of expressive communication. Under receptive communication, we try to capture if a child can respond to their name, if they can understand the moods of the caregiver and others around them, if they can understand isolated words, if the child can take turns in conversation, make choices between what they want for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and so on. Under pragmatic communication, we capture things, how does a child greetings? Can they say hello? Or communicate hello, or communicate surprise, or say goodbye? To what extent can they comfort others, play games, and use names? And we actually capture different types of communication, like number of verbal words or the number of symbols they might use in device, and so on, and gestures they use. So let me give you a sort of a framework for how we turn these concepts like refusal into actual questions on the Orca measure. And so let's take under the expressive communication, how a child might refuse an object or refuse a food or refuse what, you all maybe from many ways your child might refuse something. And so when we were looking at the concept of refusal, we conducted interviews with caregivers like yourselves with Rett syndrome. We also did interviews with caregivers of children with Angelman syndrome. And we asked caregivers, in what ways does your child refuse an object? And we heard lots of different types of answers. And so some children might cry or fuss, some might turn their head away or push the object away. Some might have their child shakes their head back and forth to say no, or use a gesture or an eye gesture. Or some kids might actually be able to use the verbal word of no, or a word approximation, or use a device. And after we heard from parents about the different ways that their child can refuse, we then worked with our communication experts, our speech language pathologists, to categorize or organize these different ways to express no into different levels. And by levels, these levels represent different levels of communication ability. And so, for example, for refusal, probably the lowest level that we heard of to express refusal is just when a child cries or fusses. The next level up of refusal may be when a child turns her head away or pushes the object away or throws the object to refuse it. And then what might represent a higher level is when a child has a distinct way of saying no by shaking their head, using a gesture, using the device, or verbally saying no. So we have the concept of refusal, we have different ways of expressing no, and we've developed these levels to represent different aspects or different hierarchies of communication ability for refusal. And those translate to our 3 levels of refusal. And for each level, we have written a question on the Orca measure. So for example, for level 1 is, did your child cry or fuss when she or he did not want an object? Level 2 is, did your child turn their head away, push the object away, or throw an object when she or he did not want it? Or the highest level for refusal is, did your child use a distinct no? Did they shake their head, use a gesture, use a word approximation, or a word, or a symbol on device to indicate that they did not want the object? So this slide is nice because it takes you from the concept of refusal on the left, shows you levels and how we translate those to actual questions. So this is an example of the actual 3 questions of refusal on the Orca measure. And so the actual questions themselves, you'll see in the second column, you know, did your child cry or fuss when he or she did not want an object, and so on there. But the other parts of the information of the Orca measure there is we've inserted this few things. One is that we've referenced the parent to the past 30 days. So we're asking, over the past 30 days, did your child observe these different behaviors, crying or fuss, turning their head, or using a distinct no? And the response options are, my child did this none of the time or only once. My child did this sometimes over the past 30 days, or my child did this almost all the time. And so depending on how their child refused an object like a book, toy, or food there, we're able to use the parent's answer to these 3 sets of questions to understand what is that child's level of communication ability as it relates to refusal. So we did the same process for all the 23 other concepts that I showed you on this particular slide here. So now that you have an appreciation of the way that we have designed the Orca measure and capture these unique communication concepts, what I want to describe for you, the last part of my talk there, is how we made sure that the Orca questionnaire is appropriate to be used as a measure of communication ability for individuals with Rett syndrome who may be participating in a future clinical trial. And this work, importantly, I want to emphasize again, we are thankful to the Rett Syndrome Research Trust to allow us the opportunity to do this work. So there are 2 different steps we use to make sure the Orca measure is appropriate for individuals with Rett syndrome. And all this involves caregivers like yourselves in this process. So we use what's called qualitative interviews, and we use quantitative research study. So the goal of our first step of qualitative interviews, we had 3 goals. The first one is to make sure that we understand what a typical communication style looks like for kids or individuals with Rett syndrome. So first, our part of our interviews was simply just learning from you all about how your child typically communicates. Where are the strengths, where are the limitations, what changes, what doesn't change in terms of communication. The second part of our goal for these qualitative interviews is, does our Orca measure make sense to them? Are parents able to understand the instructions? Are they able to understand the questions? Are they able to actually understand each of the response options? No, or only once, sometimes, or almost all the time. Do they make sense there? And then the third goal is, in talking to parents there, is we want to make sure that the Orca capture those key communication aspects that you all, the parents, observe in your own children. So those were our 3 goals of the qualitative interviews. And so what we do when we do qualitative interview, it's a one-on-one interview. One-on-one means that there is one interviewer, which is one of my research team members, Nicole, Molly, or Leslie. And they set up a phone call or a Zoom call, actually, something like what we're on now there, and talk to you, one of the caregivers of an individual with Rett syndrome, for about 1 hour. Sometimes it's shorter, A lot of times it took longer, but again, we're very thankful for your time participating. And in the interview, there was set up in 3 different sections. The first part is what we call concept elicitation. So this is like helping us in a free, open format, allowing the caregiver to tell us how their child typically communicates. What do they communicate about, and how do they typically, do they use eye gestures? Do they use their devices? So both of what types of ways they communicate and how they communicate was an important part of the first part of the interview. The second part of the interview is having the caregiver actually go through and fill out the Orca questionnaire. And the interviewer sat quietly while the parent did that. And then the third part of the interview is after the parent filled out the Orca measure, our interviewer then asked the parent, well, you know, how clear was the Orca measure? Did you understand the questions? And then importantly, did you think that Orca measure captured those things unique for your child in terms of their own communication ability? Our sampling for our qualitative interviews, we wanted to make sure that the Orca measure was appropriate for both the younger kids with Rett syndrome, as well as older individuals with Rett syndrome. So you can see our samples. We sampled parents with different age kids, 2 to 7 years, 8 to 12, 13 to 17, and then adult individuals with Rett syndrome. And we conducted 2 rounds of interviews where in each round, we have the ability to make changes to the Orca measure to make sure any changes we make are good changes and actually end up improving the measure and not hurting the measure. So and we ended up interviewing in total 19 caregivers, and of course, they have 19 children. The average age of the children of Rett syndrome was 13 years, and their age range went from 4 to 36 years. Most of the children were non-Hispanic white, but we did have 4 children, Asian, 2 Black, 1 Middle Eastern, and 1 Hispanic. The parents were mostly mothers, so about 16 of the 19 were mothers of children. All the children were female. And then the average household income was between 100 and 250,000, but importantly, about 4 were less than 80,000 as a family, as a household income. So what did we learn? So importantly, one of the key differences we found for Rett syndrome compared to the caregivers of children with Angelman syndrome is that there was a heavy limited mobility of the body and more use of eye gestures. That came through in some of our results. We also learned that use of devices was not common among the older adults with Rett syndrome, but was more common among the younger kids. We did hear that a variety of different types of communication concepts that children with Rett syndrome are able to do in terms of expressive, receptive, and pragmatic communication. So, which is very reassuring that the Orca was able to capture many of the attributes we heard about from the parents. On average, we found that parents were able to complete the Orca measure in about 15 to 20 minutes, which is consistent with what we found with other populations. And of those parents, we found that about 95% of parents who complete our Orca measure found the Orca to be somewhat or very easy to complete. And reassuringly, about 85% of the parents said the Orca measure somewhat or very well captures the child's communication abilities for girls with Rett syndrome. Some parent quotes we think are the most valuable to provide evidence for the use of the Orca measure in Rett syndrome is that one parent said, well, most of the Orca measure questions were questions that I could answer without wanting to write down, my child is, quote, physically unable, end quote. Another parent said about the Orca measure, it's much better than a normal questionnaire where they would not give credit to an eye gaze gesture or to the body movement or anything like that. So this accommodated that and gave my child her credit that she is communicating this way. So we feel very reassured, and it was wonderful to get this direct feedback on the Orca measure. We did make some modifications to the Orca measure, what we deem sort of minor modifications. So we put much more emphasis in the Rett syndrome, the Rett syndrome version of the Orca measure, focus on eye gaze as a key gesture, as well as pointing and head nodding. And then some of the examples that we used for giving directions from Angelman syndrome were used a lot of mobility, like, you know, asking the child to get a cup or take a bath. Whereas again, because of some of the mobility limitations for Rett syndrome, we added and changed out some of the examples. And one of the examples used is we asked is like giving a direction of give me a kiss, which didn't rely so much on body movements. After our qualitative evaluation, we then shifted to our quantitative study. And in this study, we collected data over time, longitude 2 assessment points. And the difference between our quantitative and qualitative is that we're collecting data from a much larger sample of parents of Rett syndrome. And so importantly, we're looking at issues of validity of the Orca measure, as well as reliability. And when I use the term validity, that means, are we measuring what we're supposed to measure, which is communication ability? And by reliability is, are we making sure we're getting consistent and reproducible scores? And I will go through examples of both of those later in my discussion. In our longitudinal quantitative study, we ended up with 279 caregivers, and probably many of you in the audience ended up filling out our questionnaires. So 270 caregivers of females with Rett syndrome. Of those 279, we asked 210 of them did follow up about a week later to answer the questionnaire again. And then in addition is we did not limit to just girls with Rett syndrome. We did open up to parents of boys with Rett syndrome. About 8 caregivers filled out our questionnaire where their child was a boy with Rett syndrome. And I'll show you briefly some of their data. And they completed our Orca measure, as well as another communication measure called the Communication and Symbolic Behavior Scale. To give you some quick overview, I'm going to move through these quickly because I want to make sure there's enough time at the end for questions. So quickly, I'm just going to summarize some of the distribution, the sample distribution. So in terms of the kids, the average age of the kids with Rett syndrome was about 14 years of age, standard deviation of 10 years. We had a majority of the children were non-Hispanic white, but we did see some, we did have some diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. Most of these children are receiving some type of therapy, which is physical therapy, occupational therapy. About 70% of the children were receiving speech therapy. About 70% of the children were using some type of device. Most of these children using devices were what's called high-tech devices, which means that it can capture their eye gestures. In terms of the parents who completed the questionnaire, 90% of them were mothers or female. The average age of the caregivers about 45 years of age, and again, predominantly white. A range of occupational status, about 64% of the parents were working part-time or full-time, and we saw a good distribution of family income. We also saw a good distribution of education level of the caregivers. About 8% were at a high school degree or less. A majority of the caregivers had some or more college education. 85% of the parents, their primary language was English, but because we did not limit our survey to US only, we saw other caregivers filling out our questionnaire in English, but they also use from other countries where they might use a different language as their primary language. About 70% of our sample of caregivers were in the United States. So what were we looking at? So there's a whole range of things that we looked at in terms of looking at, is the Orca measure was supposed to measure communication ability, and did we get reliable or consistent scores? And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, is quicker than I'd like to, but because I want to make sure I get to answer any questions you have. So if you haven't had enough caffeine, hopefully you have some coffee or caffeine next to you as we go through this next set of slides. The first thing we looked at was making sure that all 23 concepts that represent expressive communication, receptive communication, and pragmatic or social type communication, we want to make sure all of those concepts were relevant and valid reflection of a child's communication ability. And so importantly, the answer is yes. We found that all 23 of those concepts in different ways and shapes and forms were important aspects to make us feel comfortable about assessing a child with Rett syndrome's communication ability. In terms of the distribution of scores, we saw quite a wide distribution. And so what you're looking at on this slide is the distribution across the score range of Orca. And for the Orca, the lowest score possible is about a score of 27, and the highest possible score is 83. And this is what you want to see when you're trying to evaluate what your measure is actually capturing communication ability in Rett syndrome. If all the individuals were at one part of the continuum, at the floor or ceiling there, that means we do not have a sensitive measure. But the good news for the Orca is we saw a good spread of scores, which means the Orca is directly aligned to capture in individuals with Rett syndrome's communication now. And if there are future interventions in the pipeline to improve child's communication, the Orca is designed to set up to be able to assess improvements or decrements, well, hopefully no decrements, but the Orca is designed to measure if there is a gene therapy that actually improved their life, because no kid scored at the ceiling for Orca, which means that there is plenty of room for us to assess change over time. We actually, as I said, did capture, while most of the children were female, we actually had, again, parents of children with 8 males. And you can see the arrows at the bottom where those 8 children will distribute across the score distribution. So again, we see good information and good spread of the Orca scores across the individual's Rett syndrome. We also found that the Orca measure is a reliable measure. And what that means is that the Orca measure is able to differentiate true differences in communication ability when children actually did have true differences in their communication scores. So even though we know that the Orca, like every other measure, has some measurement noise or error associated, the Orca measure is still able to provide a reliable score, which is what is needed to be able to look at changes in the child's communication ability over time. We also had parents fill out another communication scale. It's called the Communication Symbolic Behavior Scale, the CSBS. And what you're looking at in this graph is the Orca measure scores on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the CSBS scores on the x-axis. And we see that there is a tight correlation between the Orca measure and this other communication measure. And the correlation is 0.73, which means that we're both measuring the same thing, but we have different perspectives there. So again, I think this is very positive and supports the Orca measure is capturing this concept of communication. We also found that the Orca measure, we compared the scores for children that use a device, an AAC device, for communication versus kids with Rett syndrome that did not use a device. And so 195 kids used devices in our sampling frame, and they got a higher score of about a 47.8 on the Orca measure. And then those kids that did not use device had an Orca score about 39.3, which is exactly what we expected, as we learned that those kids that use device typically have higher levels of communication. So in conclusion, sorry to race you through those last set of slides there, is importantly, we developed this Orca measure for the your type of kids with Rett syndrome, Angelman syndrome, or any other neurodevelopmental diseases where vocal language is not the primary way they communicate. And it was developed for use in clinical trials to identify interventions or treatments that can help your own children. Through what I've shown you today, through both our one-on-one interviews, our qualitative studies, and our quantitative studies, is we have evidence that the Orca is working well for individuals with girls with Rett syndrome. For point number C is there's always more work you can do to collect more information about the scale. So we recognize that we always need to do more and more work to help us feel more and more confident about the Orca measure for individuals with Rett syndrome. And some additional work we'd love to do is to determine what is meaningful change. So is 2 points, is 5 points, is 10 points on our Orca scale important from the parent perspective and from the child, and to help that individual improve the communication with their family and with others. In addition, we'd love to see much more diverse samples, different race, ethnicity, lower income, and other things there. So we feel like we need to collect more data in those populations to make us feel more and more confident that we're capturing communication in these populations. And then the last point I want to make in terms of conclusions is that we got funding from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is to extend the Orca to many other neurodevelopmental disorders, where to help us make sure that they too are struggling with having a good outcome measured for use in their clinical trials. So we're happy to know that the Orca is not just available for 1 or 2 populations, but for multiple populations seeking better ways and better interventions to improve their child's lives. So, and you'll get a copy of these slides. If you want more information about the Orca measure, it's available through our university's website, which is the web link on the left, which you could never remember, but luckily you'll get a copy of our slides. The access to our Orca measure is available through an organization called Pattern Health, where the Orca measure is free for use for academics, nonprofits, organizations. There is a fee for industry to be able to use a particular measure, which helps us to pay for more research on the Orca measure. And then lastly, I am very thankful, our team is very thankful for all the families that helped us produce the Orca measure and validate it. We know that your time is limited, and we are very thankful for everything you did to help us to make sure the Orca is an appropriate measure for your kids with Rett syndrome. So with that, I thank you, and I thank the funders and collaborators.
Thank you, Bryce. So, so one of the reasons we wanted to do this presentation was to give back to the families, especially those that participate in trials. And then, you know, it's hard sometimes to get those results back out. So thank you so much for summarizing all of that for this, this audience. And thank you, a really heartfelt thank you to all of the families that participated in this study. 279 families is a lot of families, and this was a big project, and we were really happy with the results. And a couple of things I just want to mention before we hop into questions. If you have questions, go ahead and pop those into the Q&A box. But you know, we're in discussions with pharmaceutical companies all the time that are developing new therapies for Rett syndrome, and this this new Rett Orca is being included in some upcoming clinical trials. So the work that has been put into this measure so far is going to be helping drug development very, very soon. So thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to say was this work is being written up, and we are going to be publishing it, or Bryce's team is going to be publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's really going to spread how quickly this new tool can be taken up by other pharmaceutical companies. Is there any other kind of like background information you wanted to add, Bryce, before we hop into questions?
No, I think because I took up way too long talking, I'll be happy to answer any questions the audience members might have.
Okay, great. Let me go in and let's see where we are with questions. Okay, we have one question from Matthew. He says, hi, we find that sometimes we answer questions about our daughter differently depending on who is asking and why. Some therapists or counselors ask us to emphasize our daughter's abilities and some her limitations. How does the Rett Orca measure account for such confirmation biases?
Yeah, a wonderful question, Matthew. That could actually be like a whole hour conversation right there. You know, and this gets to one of the points I made earlier in my talk there, is that if we look at communication ability, it's one of those unique things that you could ask, as you said, different people to answer what they think that child's communication ability is. And we could ask if it's both a mother or father there. We have the mother there, the father there, the grandparent there. We could ask the speech language pathologist, could ask the clinician there. And then if we look across all these different people, they're all going to they'll be associated to it, they'll be able to relate to it, but they won't be perfect because they're all seeing that child from a different perspective, and they're judging that child's communication ability based on their own experiences and perspectives, whether through themselves, what they see from other children, and from other things there. And so the point being is that we don't think that one perspective is right and another perspective is wrong. What we think is that each one is unique and valuable to help us understand what is that child's communication ability. And so what we recommend for like research purposes is that if someone was determined to measure communication ability, like for a clinical trial or a natural history study, we suggest of course, using our Orca measure because we think the parent's perspective is important, but we also recommend that you also have other measures of communication, like from the speech language pathologist perspective as well. And then what is then necessary is to then how you combine those pieces of information to give it a more holistic view of what's going on in that child's lives.
Yeah, and I can add just a little bit to that from the drug development perspective. When you're including a questionnaire like the Orca or another assessment tool in a trial, there is an effort to limit who's answering those questions. So if the mother is the one who starts at that initial baseline visit, she should be the one that's answering that, using that assessment tool throughout that child's participation in the study. And that way you can kind of limit that perspective, that personalized perspective that Bryce was talking to. When you have different individuals answering the same questionnaire, you're going to get different answers. So you want to try to limit that rater bias by kind of designating one person to always answer that questionnaire for that child. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do right now, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we could always set up a study in the future and ask them if there's a mother father that's had them filled out and then compare them. We have a case study in this particular study of one where we actually found out for the same child with Rett syndrome, the mother and father filled out the survey. And I don't remember what the exact score range was, but the score was like something like 58.2 and 58.7. So it was two things, but their scores are almost aligned perfectly. And again, that's only a case study of one, so I'm not going to say that that's always going to happen, but it was reassuring to see that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's see. We have another question here from Catherine. Can the Orca measure be used in an educational setting? There are few, if any, educational assessments that can reliably measure our kids' communication and comprehension.
That's an excellent question. And it's something that we've been asked before. Our mandate when we developed the Orca measure was to develop it for use in clinical trials. Point being is that it's a very rigorously comprehensive measure to look at where a child is, where they start and where they end, and to look at sensitive to changes overall. So that was sort of our initial mandate, and I think the mandate of the Rett Syndrome Research Trust. Could this be used in an educational setting to help identify where a child has strengths and limitations? We do feel like there's a lot of great measures out there that probably do that better than maybe Orca right now, like the communication matrix, the Bailey scale. I'm sure I'm gonna miss some other scales out there, but point being is that those scales have been developed mostly to be used from the educational thing. Now, could the Orca measure eventually end up being used in education? It may be. It might be a good measure used there, but I think that would require us to think carefully of how to repackage the Orca in terms of not changing the questions, but how we can summarize and feed back that data to the caregiver or to the SLP or whoever the educator is to help them figure out where are those areas that we can help that child. So I'm not saying the Orca can't do that, but right now it's really mostly developed for clinical trials.
Thank you. All right, we're coming up on just almost to the end of our time, I just want to ask this one more question that should be an easy one from David and Celia. Did this trial include countries outside of the USA? I think
the quick answer is yes. We did about 70% of the parents were in the US, so 30% outside the United States. That's definitely not saying it's representative of those other countries, but the short answer is yes, we opened up to outside there, but it was limited to English speaking only. The good news, though, is that the Orca measure has been translated to multiple languages, French, Spanish, Chinese, German. I'm going to forget so many others there, but so the Orca measure is available in other languages, but for purposes of our work that I showed today was limited to only the English version.
Thank you. Okay, I think that we have answered all of the questions that came in through the Q&A. So I think I'm going to go ahead and close this webinar for today. Thank you. A big thank you to the 279 families who made this research possible. Thank you to Dr. Bryce Reeve and his team for developing the Orca specifically for Rett. And we're looking forward to the publication and your presentations in these upcoming conferences on this amazing work. So we'll be keeping the community updated on all of our progress with this project. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you.